What's up, guys? You're listening to a April 5th edition of the Splash Ag Podcast. Today, I'm joined by my good buddy Sid, who I haven't had on for a little while, but he and I have been chatting quite a bit through, obviously, with all that's been going on recently, as well as before that, we were definitely chatting a lot of hoops. We just hadn't quite had the chance to put it on the podcast platform. So, without further ado, how you doing, man?
Doing pretty good. Glad to be back and talking hoops with you. It's always fun
Yeah,
time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's no games going on, so my first question to you is what's the, I guess with this cancellation of sports and such, is there any kind of epiphany or thing you really miss, like something that really surprised you about this sports void in these times?
I don't know about surprising because if you were to tell me even a year ago or before that there would be no NBA playoffs, I would have been pretty disappointed. Same with March Madness. So just imagining that it's April and usually the playoffs should be around the corner, but that's not quite happening, and just the uncertainty of whether there will be an NBA season or they're just going to jump straight to next season. So yeah, it's definitely disappointing and just not had yeah that it's a void. But yeah, just really the only thing is just going back and watching some old highlights, and I know ESPN has been doing a bunch of reruns of old finals games, so that's the best we got right now. So
Yeah,
that's all I can do.
yeah, the old, what is it? The classic re-airs, I guess, and all the various rewinds that they're putting on NBA TV, ESPN,
Yeah,
even just YouTube. I feel like there's been obviously a demand for that because, like you said, this is the time of year. The Final Four was supposed to be yesterday. College championship supposed to be tomorrow. Then after that,
right.
it's like that final week of the NBA season where teams are seeing, where they can position themselves in the playoffs. Some teams are trying to make the playoffs,
Yeah,
and then you finally know 1 to 8 both conferences, and then that I always love that first Saturday, getting the first look at the matchups. And I feel like everybody has a tendency to overreact a little bit to what they see in a game one. But I always
hmm,
just really enjoy that Saturday. The games start at noon. The final game is at 10:30. So you can, in theory, be watching playoff basketball for like 13 hours. And like I've said before, playoff basketball, in terms NBA playoff basketball, there is no higher quality basketball than that. So the product itself, is always going to be best of the best.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just yeah, you're right. Definitely the intrigue of the matchups and who's playing who are the marquee the players that are going up against each other. It's always the best quality of competition. So yeah, we're missing out, and it is what it is.
Yeah. Also, I guess when you talk about old rewinds and classic games, and obviously one thing that's relatively new and fresh. Not that it was really a surprise, but yesterday they announced the 2020 Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame class, and so I actually asked you to come on because I wanted to actually just kind of chop it up about some of these Hall of Famers. So first and foremost, the for I guess for those who don't know that are listening, the three NBA players that were inducted were Kevin Garnett, Kobe Bryant, and Tim Duncan. And my first question to you is actually, how did you feel about them not having Chris Bosh in the 2020 class, partially because they wanted these three to kind of go in as their own class?
Um, I'm I'm actually okay with that because there's something special about this particular group and their era. I believe they all played in around the same uh, late '90s, early 2000s era, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's already just an excellent Hall of Fame class. And I believe that even if say they had Chris Bosh joining in, he would kind of be in their shadow. So
Yeah.
in a way, you can say that it's probably even good for him to sort of to wait a year or two. Whenever I'm sure he will be in the Hall of Fame very soon. But I think having these three, it's very suitable, and they played in the league around the same time. Obviously had a bunch of matchups against one another. I know Duncan and Kobe, of course, the Lakers, Spurs. They were the two kings of the Western Conference for a while, and then Kevin Garnett. He was in the Western Conference, and he did go up against. I believe I can't recall exactly, but I know he was in the West, and they made the playoffs a couple times, but he couldn't get past the first round. Um, and obviously the Kobe and Duncan were a big part of the just why the West was so difficult. And then of course Kevin Garnett went to the Celtics and ended up playing Kobe in the finals twice. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
there's just a lot of memorable moments with these three guys, and so I think it's definitely special to see all three of them at the same time be inducted.
Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And I think what's actually ironic is I think the one time that KG advanced past the first round in the Western Conference, that was his MVP season, 2004, and that he actually ended up playing the Lakers in the conference finals, and then they lost to the Lakers. So, like you said, the three of them, they've gone against each other. Obviously, they kind of defined quite a long time period. They were some of the defining players, and they're just so obviously they're very linked based on, like you mentioned, all the battles that they had.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, Chris Bosh, of course, he was drafted in 2003, so he was like a bit later as far as his era goes, and so I think yeah, I think it just makes sense to have these three guys kind of grouped
Yeah,
separately.
yeah,
So.
yeah. I agree with you. I love Chris Bosh. I actually think he's kind of. I think he's pretty under. I actually think he's pretty underrated. Chris
Yeah.
Bosh. Well, so a couple things. I actually, like you said, I think with Chris Bosh being in a later year, and we could talk about this later, but I think you should put him in next year in a class that's not as loaded. I think we'll have a
Mhm.
lot more time to reflect and think and really appreciate Chris Bosh for what he was, because I think that Chris Bosh, like you said, he's more being drafted in 2003. He's more in that LeBron, Carmelo, Dwayne Wade, Chris Paul, Dwight Howard.
Mhm.
That he's more in that kind of. He's more of that generation, and obviously he unfortunately had the blood clot issue, and that's what made him retire early. I
Mhm.
honestly think you put him in today's game, I think he'd be way more. I think he'd get way more. I think he'd get way more love.
Oh yeah, his style of play would have definitely fit in very nicely in today's league, and obviously he's one of the stretch fours or stretch fives. He was very, from a position standpoint, he was very flexible, and he needed to actually adapt and adjust with in playing with the Heat. So I think that would have definitely done some damage in today's league as well. You see a lot that, in a way, that paved the way for a lot of other guys now. So yeah, and yeah, like you said, Chris Bosh very underrated. And I'll never forget that he, in the 2012 playoffs, he actually got injured against the Pacers, and then you saw the Heat's their play. They had a tough time beating the Pacers in the second round, and then I
Yeah,
believe in the conference finals, they were up 2-0, but then the Celtics, of course, stormed back and ended up going up 3-2. And I think Chris Bosh came back for Game 5 of that Celtics series. And then, of course, we all remember that, Game 6, LeBron went insane and had 45 points. But that Game 7 at home, I do recall Chris Bosh having a really good game and hitting uh, three pointers in the fourth quarter, if I'm
yep,
not mistaken. So he came up big, and he ended up being like proving to be a very critical piece to that Heat super team. So
Yeah, you actually nailed it. I pulled up his career playoff game log, and you're right. He returned in Game 5 of the Boston series, and then in Game 7, he did play well, and he actually hit a total of three-pointers, all of which were, I believe, in the fourth quarter. So
mhm.
shout out, good on you remembering remembering all that. Because I remembered him returning and hitting a couple threes, but to get that number down, three threes in the fourth, I'm impressed.
Yeah, like I mean that was definitely a really good game, and the Celtics they came to play, and so the Heat needed every bit of the just the help from everyone on their squad, and I know Chris Bosh he stepped up. So I mean he was criticized, being like the third wheel to LeBron and D Wade, and folks question, how much is he contributing, but I thought that those playoffs it showed that he was very important, and I think just the rest of his tenure with the Heat, he did come up big in certain moments, and really when he was at his best, they were unstoppable because
Yeah.
LeBron and D Wade, they were going to get theirs, and then if he showed up, it's you know the rest of the league was didn't have much of an answer.
Yeah, and not to make this too much of a Chris Bosh podcast, but
Right? Yeah.
the last thing I will say before I'm sure we'll talk about Chris Bosh when we talk about the 2021 Hall of Fame class, but
Yeah.
um, obviously there were memes, there were jokes made about him being the third banana, but honestly, what I commend him the most for is the fact that he was willing to make that sacrifice to be a guy who might not have gotten all the hype and the accolades and the highlights, but was willing to do a lot of the intangibles and the dirty work. And when you look at the Heat Big Three, he's the only one of those guys that you would say was probably a guy who could play as a quote unquote rim protector for 36, 40 minutes a game. And on top of that, I would argue that by the end of the Heatles, that Chris Bosh was actually the second best player on the Heat. And so I really, like I said, I think he's been criminally underrated just because obviously the abrupt retirement. But I honestly, what I commend him the most for is the fact that he was willing to make those sacrifices to be on an all-time team and do the small things because we see this a lot in all sports, honestly. People want more for themselves, and I don't blame them because you want to see what you can accomplish the most as an individual. But what I really respect about Chris Bosh was that he got to see the peak of being like an individual, getting up numbers in Toronto, but then he was like, is this really how I want to spend the rest of my career? So he was willing to make that sacrifice. And to me, I think whenever a guy takes a little bit of a backseat to play a role, that's something I will never crap on a guy for doing that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that sacrifice is key, and yeah, much respect to him, and yeah, I'm glad he got to enjoy some of that success in Miami after making those sacrifices.
Yeah. So I guess transitioning to the 2020 class, what I want to do is I want to go through each of the three guys. We can both just maybe talk a little bit about, you know, what we appreciated, so maybe some stories and whatnot, and go through a little bit of their career. But I'm gonna start by going. I'm gonna go oldest to, or I guess the most senior to the by experience. So I guess to
Sure.
start to talk about to start, let's talk about Kevin Garnett, who I'm actually curious because you're a Mavs fan. I
Hmm.
grew up I grew up a Lakers fan, Kobe fan, and so
Right.
to me, I don't think I ever rooted for Kevin Garnett because I was too young to remember the Minnesota days. Also, like you mentioned earlier, they often were a team losing in the first round, not really a contender. He
Yeah.
comes to Boston. I absolutely hated the man. And then when he and then when he was in Brooklyn, Brooklyn wasn't like they had the hype, and then they had that year where the 13-14 year where they were a super they there was a lot of expectations, but they kind of underwhelmed, and I didn't really root for him then. And then towards the end of his career, he was in Minnesota again, but those Minnesota teams were lottery bound, so it wasn't like I had a reason to root for or against him then. So I'm curious, like, tell me about as a basketball fan, what your relationship and uh, your relationship with Kevin Garnett as a basketball fan was.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. I never particularly rooted for him, and I was also too young to really remember or watch him with the Timberwolves, like when he was first with the team. And but I don't think I would have rooted for him anyway because I know he and the Mavs, the Mavs and the Timberwolves played each other. I want to say in 2002. And,
Yep.
yeah, and the Mavs ended up winning that series. So I, of course, would have been I would have enjoyed that, but also been on the other side of it. But I mean, with Kevin Garnett, it was always respect, and I guess you can say he was one of the rival power forwards to Dirk, who was my favorite player, and as was Tim Duncan. So that kind of makes it more of he's a competition. And then when he was with the Celtics, of course, the Celtics were not a particularly likable team, and didn't really want to see them win. But he was, I mean, he was definitely fun, and the intensity that he brought to the table was something to appreciate as just a basketball fan. The Celtics Heat matchups, those are, I think, the most memorable for me, just because they're still somewhat recent, like
Mm-hmm.
2011, 2012, and the Celtics, of course, they gave it to the Heat, even though the Heat ended up emerging victorious, and Garnett had a lot to do with that, and he stepped up, and he was also older too. Like the Celtics were a much older team by the time the Heatles had emerged. So, but they were still not gonna back down. And then, of
Yeah.
course, when the Celtics first formed their big three, uh, they were, of course, they were kind of I guess you can say, the blueprint for sort of bringing superstars together and trying to just mesh their styles and trying to win the title. Of course, they got one, and I'll of course never forget his post game interview when he said yelled anything is possible.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think that like he was definitely great for the NBA,
Mm-hmm.
despite whether you rooted for him or rooted against him. He was good for the league.
Absolutely. Quick point: you bring up Duncan and Dirk. Obviously, these three are probably the three iconic power forwards from this same era, this late '90s to I'd say like 2010s
Hmm.
time period.
Yeah.
I if I'm be I will say I even though I would put Cage even though I would if I were starting a team I would pick Duncan and Dirk probably over KG. I will say KG at his peak, KG might have been the most versatile defender of the three, which I think would have favored him a lot in today's NBA, more so
Oh
than
yeah.
those the late '90s, because if obviously, like you said, we only saw the when we think of KG, you and I think of the Boston KG, but even in Boston, he was able to switch. He was a guy who really could. I'd say he could realistically switch 2 to 5 for a whole game, and he could switch onto a point guard for possessions,
Yeah.
depending on who it was. But so and when you talk about rim protection, he is up there
Oh yeah.
as one of the better rim protectors of his time. So, and the fact that he was getting steals as a big man, he
Yeah.
moved incredibly well. That's one thing you like to see in a big guy, is that they can move very well. He was also smart in passing out of the double teams when he would post up. He was I think we're in the same page. I don't think either of us ever really rooted for him or even liked him.
Hmm.
But now that I've gone older and had a chance to just kind of sit back and reflect and whatnot, one thing I really do appreciate is just how much he cared, the intensity that he had, and the fact that in a and I'm not saying this is bad, but in a day and age where we see guys smiling after losses and dapping each other up, swapping jerseys every game and whatnot.
Hmm.
KG was like none of that, and obviously he made the airwaves this past December when he was talking about how he thought that he and the Celtics broke LeBron, and how he said that if they ran into LeBron and Wade, and they would just say what's up and keep it moving.
Hmm.
Um, You and I talked about that actually, but
Yeah.
um, part of me is like, okay, that's a little bit extreme, like, but then part of me is also like, in some ways, I feel like if I were playing in such heated competition at the highest level, and someone beat me, part of me would definitely take it some kind of way and wouldn't be like dapping them up and buttering them up. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, I mean I can completely respect that too. I mean, I felt the only extreme part I felt was when he tried to say that like there's this whole thing like I don't like fuck with you, we don't fuck with us, this kind of thing.
Yeah,
But like I mean, like the thing is, I completely understand like there were rivals. It's like there's no friend like not friends here, but I am also of the mindset that like after it's been some years, I don't know if I can relate to it being to that level.
sure.
Like of course like saying hi and keeping it moving, that's fine, but I guess it seems like he still feels that intensity from when
Yeah.
he was playing. Um, so I can't say I completely I relate to that, but that's how he is, and I knowing how he was as a player, I can't say I'm too surprised, but it's a interesting. I would say it's a unique perspective as well, because I don't think like Kobe and Duncan are like that, even though they probably didn't particularly you know they weren't being all fraternizing as
Sure.
while they were competing. I'm sure now if they saw each other, I mean, like it was just all um cool, and how's it going, how's retirement life, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess the last point on this with regards to Kevin Garnett, I do disagree with him when he says that they broke LeBron because we all saw what LeBron did in Game Six in Boston. But
Yeah.
what I can say about KG that well, one thing is I mean KG, I think he plays with such an intensity and energy that I think that he's a guy who genuinely needs to like have that built in, like built up, talk to himself to get himself like up and like hyped up for a game.
Yeah.
What I will say is, I saw him sitting courtside at the Lakers Celtics game. He gave LeBron dap.
Hmm.
He dapped LeBron up when LeBron went up to him, and so I don't think it's like he holds this grudge against him. But what I will say about KG is he always kept it 100. Like he's not like what I do agree with him in principle is that I think he's when that interview that he gave, I think what he's saying is that like him and Dwayne Wade aren't best friends, right?
Oh yeah.
Obviously, so he's not going to pretend like they're best friends. They're acquaintances. He says hi. How's the family doing? How's retirement going? All that. Same deal with him and LeBron. I'm sure that deep down he has an admiration and respect for LeBron, but especially when you're playing and
Hmm.
you're in these super high level, super emotionally draining series,
Hmm.
I'm sure that like of course, like you're like, nah, screw that guy. So I understand some of how KG went about it. Don't know if that's. I'm not saying not saying that if I were in his position, that's 100% of how I would have gone about it. But like, I really, I do. Well, that is one thing I really can't appreciate is his honesty and how he was always he always kept that intensity up and he was very sincere about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's Kevin Garnett in a nutshell. So, yeah, it kind of circles back to like it was good for the league. It was definitely a very memorable sports figure during in multiple eras.
Yeah. I guess moving on, we got so KG drafted 95. In
Mm,
96, we have my guy, my as I've outlined before, my childhood, my lifelong hero, the late
yeah.
great Kobe Bean Bryant. Obviously with Kobe passing, it's it's a little somber, but
Hmm.
and you and I have talked so much, obviously over personal, FaceTime chat about Kobe.
Yeah.
So I'm honestly not even sure where this conversation is going to take us because I feel like a lot of the stuff we've already kind of talked about behind closed doors. But my first question to you is once again, as a Mavs fan, Kobe, two-time champions, only plays, or sorry, plays the Mavs, Dirk and the Mavs only one time in the playoffs. They're the back-to-back reigning champions.
Hmm.
Obviously, Mavericks sweep the Lakers. I'm curious how similar to the question I asked about KG, what was your basketball relationship as a fan like with the Mamba?
Mamba, yeah. I mean, obviously, all respect, but and like you said, they only played each other once in a playoff series, and that was 2011. So it wasn't as much as um, the intense head-to-head competition, and so like I never felt that disappointment and just I like fans just intensity of like Kobe doing all the damage that he used to do to other teams. Like I didn't feel that I was on that recipient end from a fan's point of view because of the fact that the Mavs and the Lakers just happened to they never really ran into each other despite being in the playoffs all those years. But the Lakers were the one of the kings of the West, like I always mention. So they were kind of the guy that they had those targets on their backs. And as a Mavs fan, I always felt like, oh man, we need to like they got to need to position themselves for the playoffs and need to build their team and in case because if they do end up facing the Lakers, this is of course going to be extremely difficult. So they were always just a team that I would be eyeing and thinking, oh man, it's gonna be really tough to beat them. And I just thought that every year, and it was only 2011 when it finally like it happened when the Mavs and Lakers met. And of course, we all know what happened. And I think timing was a huge aspect of it. Like, like the Kobe and the Lakers had just won back to back, and there was a lot of you can say wear and tear, having
Hmm.
played that many games. And then the Mavs, they were just the way they built that team. They having Tyson Chandler to kind of counteract the Lakers big man tandem. And of course they were hungry. Dirk was on a mission, so it aligned pretty well for me and the Mavs. But they were the Lakers. It was always like then Kobe. It was always respect, but it was still a bit of like they are the rival they are the competition.
Hmm.
But of course, I was always admired him from afar, and of course when the Lakers weren't playing, when they were playing other teams, um, going up against like the Spurs, the Celtics, always just appreciated what Kobe brought to the table, and uh, just watching him play. It was a treat to watch him. But with all that being said, I'm not gonna act like I particularly rooted for him because he was the competition, right? Like I would kind of hope that the Lakers would, uh, especially during the regular season. I used to think, oh man, it'd be nice if the Mavs could overtake them in the standings. So, like to be honest, yeah, I would think that it'd be nice if the Lakers could lose a few games and the Mavs could catch up to them. But aside from that, I wouldn't really call it a rivalry. It was more just they're competition, just like the rest of the Western Conference. So,
Yeah,
but I would say it's different from Tim Duncan and the Spurs for sure because the Mavs and Spurs had a lot of battles in the playoffs.
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that was kind of cool was I feel like of a lot of the superstars that in this time period, I feel like even though even though at first glance it might not seem this way, I always felt like there was actually quite a lot in common between Kobe and Dirk. And
Yeah.
ironic, ironically, those were two guys growing up where because of how much attention to detail they put into, you know, the smallest things regarding skill work, whether it was footwork, um, you know timing and the nitty gritty details of their releases and things like that. And obviously, both of them were incredibly skilled, very good shooters, very versatile, especially on the offensive end. Those were two guys that I always thought that, even though it might not seem that way, I always thought that there was actually quite a bit in common. And those were two guys I definitely grew up watching and wanting to mimic. Obviously, Kobe more to an extent, but yeah, I mean, I mean, I know how I feel about Kobe, obviously, and it's tough. It's really sad, honestly, that we're not going to hear him give his own speech at his own Hall of Fame induction, but uh, obviously that's been discussed quite a bit ad nauseum. One thing that I think is and I think actually what I appreciate about a lot of the conversations we've had over the years is I think I think a lot of the things that I appreciated about Kobe that maybe weren't as obvious or maybe people overlooked, I think you actually understood what I was appreciating.
Mhm.
A lot of the things, whether it came to his mindset and how he viewed competition, and to tie this back into what we were saying about KG, I think that because of who Kobe was, I think there was this common reputation that he held grudges, he didn't like people, and I honestly think I will believe this. I really deep down believe this, but I actually don't think that Kobe held on to grudges. I think that, and this is something that I've tried to channel in my own life, is that I really think that he was inspired by competition. And yes, when guys beat him, or he saw one person succeeding while he wasn't succeeding, I really think that made him, that even though it drove him crazy a little bit, I really think that he deep down actually liked it because it always kept him on edge, and it always made him feel like he had something, like he shouldn't just be complacent. And I genuinely believe this. I think the only people that he may have genuinely deep down disliked were people that actually tried to do something like malicious to him. And one example I'll give is Dante Jones. Dante Jones on multiple occasions tried to hurt Kobe and had some pretty dirty plays on him. And I think that he probably didn't really like Dante Jones, to give an example. But there was this belief that, oh, he didn't like LeBron because LeBron was, there was all this hype about LeBron. I don't think that was the case. I really think that he was someone that liked to see other basketball players be the best version of themselves so that they could elevate the whole sport of basketball. And I'm sure that, yes, he was competing against Duncan, Dirk, KG, Pierce, all these guys, but I don't think it was one of those things where he held grudges because other people won and he didn't, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with you. And a few of the like Kobe quotes and things I will remember is actually his interview with Shaq. I believe he actually said to Shaq that when Shaq went to Miami and when he was in the finals in 2006, he says he wanted him to get that championship. And even though it was going to mean that Shaq had 4 and Kobe had 3 at the time, he said that I feel like I needed that to motivate me to get back to work and just try to match it. And of course he ended up matching it and then overtaking Shaq with championships. But I think about that, and then yeah, it's like it's not that he was actually rooting for Shaq to get that championship so that it could push him. So I think about that, and then of course to your point about like with Dirk, of course 2011 when the Mavs beat the Lakers, Kobe actually mentioned in Dirk's documentary that he knew that they had an amazing chance. They had the team chemistry and the camaraderie to win it all after having played them in that series. And then he said that he was ultimately very happy for Dirk when he ended up winning because of how hard he worked to get to that point. So that definitely speaks volumes for how Kobe was. And he was all about, you got to earn it. You got to, work your ass off to get in order to accomplish a goal. And I feel like he was always had that mentality of, people who do that, they deserve to to taste that success. So I, that's I feel like, with the rest of the competition, the league, he I feel he knows that everyone earned it, and so and then he would use that as fuel for himself to say, now it's my turn to earn it. And of course he had so much success in the league, so his mentality was second to none.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good, that what you bringing up the quote that he gave about Dirk. I think that yes, he was obviously this fiery and probably one of the most fiery and intense competitors that the NBA has seen. But one thing I will say is, at least from when I watched him, he always displayed good sportsmanship. I don't ever remember him discrediting his opponent when they beat him. When they bowed out, he would acknowledge, hey, they played well. They did this, this, and this very well. I remember specifically the 2012 series against Oklahoma City. He outlined three very insightful basketball points about what OKC did very well to beat the Lakers. And but he would always follow that up by saying, but I'm also going to use this as a chance to get better. And hopefully come back again and have another opportunity at winning a championship. And so I think one thing that gets really lost in the shuffle sometimes is that, sometimes when you're that competitive and intense, sometimes people will portray you as like a sore winner and a sore loser. And I don't think that was the case. And one last quick point in this whole kind of misconception department about Kobe. I genuinely remember when I was a freshman in high school, that was the Dwight Howard, Steve Nash super team that everyone knows about. And I remember that summer when Dwight Howard left, every meme, every joke was, oh man, Kobe's about to this. They would put a picture of someone that was really angry, and it would be like Kobe when he sees that Dwight Howard is leaving and all this stuff. And then in the interviews, he would always say, like, nah, man, like, he's a free agent. It's his choice. Obviously, it didn't work out the way we want, but, like, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. And I remember people would always say, like, oh, he's just saying that for the interview. He's just saying that to save face and all this. But I don't know. I always genuinely believe that he never actually held a grudge against Dwight. He kind of was like, okay, we tried. Didn't quite work the way we wanted. I pitched him on playing with me or re-signing with the Lakers. He chose that he thought that wasn't best for him. Let's just keep it moving. And so, like, I think that's another good example where everybody in the world wanted to paint it as this Kobe and Dwight beef. I really don't think Kobe thought that much about Dwight Howard, like when he went home and was eating dinner. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely not. I don't think he spent a single second knowing him. He was probably just thinking about what he needs, what he can do better in his own team. He was always just focusing on the task at hand.
Yeah, and speaking of Dwight Howard, I was definitely glad to see him, show up to a Laker game and dab Dwight up, and then to hear that Dwight actually reached out to Kobe about helping him out with the dunk contest. As crazy of a competitor as he was, I don't think that he lacked self-awareness, and I don't think that he really held on to. I don't really think that he would let, things that happened in a game of basketball really trickle down to his day-to-day and his general sanity and happiness, with the exception of course, like I said, if someone had done something malicious. I will say Dante Jones, I do not like Dante Jones, and a lot of that is kind of what I outlined earlier about some of the tricks he was doing on Kobe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, that's obviously it's a dirty tactics. It's not cool, and it that actually makes it more personal than it makes
absolutely right. Exactly. And real quick point on Kobe. Last point on Kobe. I think one thing that is, in some ways, you could argue we don't see as much these days is just the fact that he played every single game. And he was just so incredibly durable in a time in an era where people didn't really take nights off. I'm talking like there wasn't resting healthy players, and the game in the early 2000s was definitely more physical and whatnot. And if you go to his game log, there's a period from 2005 to 2012 where he barely misses any games. He
Yeah.
misses 2 games. So for 1 year he misses 2 games, then he misses 5 games. Then what's crazy is his MVP year, he doesn't miss a single game. They go to the finals, they lose to the Celtics. The year after that, he doesn't miss a game again. So he plays another 82 games, goes to the finals again. So that's obviously a lot of minutes. Then
Yeah.
the 2010 season, he misses 9 games. I remember that year I think he broke one of his fingers, so he had to change his form. He misses 9 games. They go to the finals again. So once
Yeah.
again, a lot of basketball. And then 2010-11, he plays 82 games again. So in 4 seasons, three in a 4 season stretch, he goes to the finals 3 times and he plays 82 games 3 times. And I think that that's something that's pretty rare. Like as incredible as LeBron going to 9 straight finals is, let's call it how it is. LeBron definitely takes some nights off. Sometimes doesn't play at all.
Yeah.
And he's only hit the 82 game mark once
Right.
in his career. So I think that the overall durability, especially before the Achilles injury, I think that's something that I definitely always really admired about Kobe was that he was incredibly durable, obviously, but the fact that he played so hard every time he did play, and he was making deep postseason runs, and he could have had
Yeah.
every excuse to say, "Nah, I'm gonna take it easy this night," but he never did. So that's one thing that regardless of how you felt about him as a player, I think that that's something that anybody can admire.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's like, I mean, that's just insane. And I mean, he played through so many injuries. He was playing through that finger injury in the finals against the Celtics. I believe he had another lingering thing. I don't know if his ankle or his foot or he was just he was battling through a couple nagging injuries, but he just fought through it and still pulled it off. So
Yeah,
that's um, some crazy stuff. That's all I can
yeah,
say.
yeah. Last point on that, just to piggyback off of that point you made. I once saw an ESPN or might not have been an ESPN. Sorry, I don't remember who it was, but it was a graphic that basically it pointed out every injury of his that he suffered in his career. It was like a chart, and then it also had it was kind of like one of those X-ray diagrams, and it was kind of crazy. He literally got hurt like basically everywhere, and
Wow.
yet prior to prior to the Achilles injury and going forward, he played a lot of games despite that. Like you said, sometimes it was a nagging ankle. He definitely had nagging ankle injuries, and once in the finals, actually, 2000, when Jalen Rose admitted that he actually tried to injure Kobe. Um, but yeah, I just think that's kind of crazy. Like you look at that chart, and he literally got hit everywhere and injured in so many places, like upper body, lower body, core, left side, right side, both arms. It was nuts. Just the fact that he went through all that, but he just like you said, he played through stuff, but he also just he just loved to play and wanted to play, and I think that's obviously like I said, something that anybody, regardless of what type of basketball you like, can admire.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But
Yeah.
yeah, so obviously, rest in peace to the late great Kobe. Sucks that we won't hear him give a speech, but you know, uh, even though even though he obviously went at a very young age, he gave us quite a bit, which I'll always love him for.
Oh yeah. It was definitely a treat watching him play, and he will be missed in many ways.
Yeah, I guess moving on to our last guy, the big fundamental, Tim
Yeah.
Duncan.
Hmm.
So I'll let you go first. You alluded to the fact that obviously the Spurs and the Mavs had quite a few battles. I think we can or we can discuss this in a second, but I would like to think that '06 is probably the most intense battle they had. But so I'm curious, uh,
Yeah.
how did you consume and take in Tim Duncan while he was playing?
Well, I mean, of course, it was again, it's respect at the end of the day, but I mean, he was a rival. He was a power forward rival to Dirk, and then the Spurs were a rival as a team to the Mavs, and they met in the playoffs numerous times. It's like 2001, 2003, 06, 09, 2010, and 2014. So a lot of battles, and more often than not, the Spurs emerged victorious. So it was, I mean, as much as I respected and acknowledge that Tim Duncan is one of the best players in the league, and just a model of consistency. I of course couldn't really root much for him and the Spurs. So they were, again, they had the targets on their backs, and I of course really wanted to see the Mavs to figure out how to beat them. And so it was a lot of frustrating moments watching the teams play each other, but also it makes for memories. And it was also, Tim Duncan and the Spurs are actually in a lot of ways a huge part of Dirk's career arc and his growth. Like Dirk figure eventually in 2006, after that hard fought and intense series, uh, finally coming out on top. That was, I mean, Dirk, that game seven, the waning moments of game seven, when Dirk had that and one, the layup and one. That was one of the defining moments of his career. So, and then Dirk actually even described the Spurs, and they were the big brother to the Mavs. So they were. He described it that, like, they were the guys that the Mavs were really trying to. They had a bunch of battles and trying to figure out how to beat, and in which they finally figured it out in '06. So yeah, I mean, Duncan and the Spurs. When you talk about Dirk and his career, the Spurs are of course going to come up. So yeah, I mean, if looking back at it again, I mean, they were. It's just a lot of respect to them, and uh, Tim Duncan is. He was great for so long too. I mean, he was still phenomenal in 2013 and 2014 when the Spurs went back to the finals and
Mm.
won that fifth championship. So yeah, Duncan, like, he was just like I said, a model of consistency.
Yeah. You mentioned 2013 and 14, which we will talk about in a second, but he was actually really good in the 2015 playoffs, like the regular season as well. But the playoffs, I remember they had that intense first round series against the Clippers,
Right.
and that was ironically, that was actually the only series where I rooted for the Spurs
Hmm.
in my life, which kind of nuts. But what was I gonna say? Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like you said, he was so good for so long. Plus the fact that he was good, he played college for 4 years. He was just, like you said, just this model of consistency. And obviously, you and I'm sure, like you said, we never really rooted for the Spurs, but we always had the utmost amount of respect for, R.C. Buford, Greg Popovich,
Hmm.
Duncan. I actually really liked Tony Parker I mean, I still do, but once upon a time, I definitely remember trying to bust out some Tony Parker moves. I even had his shoes.
Nice.
But yeah, I want to go back to 2013, 2014, those years, because that's obviously a little fresher in our minds, and those were probably the best Spurs, those that stretch, I guess, like 2012, 2013, up till 2016. Those are the elite Spurs teams that you and I remember watching the
Hmm.
most.
Yeah.
So I'm actually curious because I'm actually curious for what you think. Obviously, the 2014 team was the one that got a lot of people. I remember there was there were so many highlights of how the Spurs were moving the ball around, and that obviously had an influence on future teams like Golden State. But I'm curious. That team gets remembered for winning the championship, but I actually think that the 2013 San Antonio Spurs might have been a better team, the one that that basically was so close to beating Miami in the playoffs. I'm curious for what you think, as because I know that you obviously watched a lot of those games as well.
Yeah, and I can't disagree with you. I mean, they were just phenomenal that year, and I mean, the Heat, people like the thing is that was the peak of the Heat as well. Like that was the year in which, it's LeBron had seemingly like figured it out. He had gotten his championship in 2012, and then the next season he came back and he was still hungry and ready to just just be the king of the league. And the Heat, that I believe they had what, a 27 game winning streak
Yep.
that season as well. So I mean they were the unquestionably the favorite going into those playoffs and throughout the playoffs. So the Spurs, of course, an amazing challenge ahead of them, and they came as close as you can possibly get to beating them. And of course, the ball bounced a few certain ways, and Ray Allen, his incredible shot, and there was some couple like little questionable decisions, I guess, in the end. Not having Tim Duncan on defense for rebounding, but again, it was still very crazy odds that the Heat had to overcome to even go to overtime, and we all know what happened after that. So, I mean, but yeah, going back to the Spurs, like to even get to that position, to almost beating that Heat team that year, I mean, that would have been absolutely insane. So, yeah, I have to agree because 2014, the Spurs were, of course, they were hungry, they were great, they were consistently the best team that year, hands down. But there were still some up and down moments. Actually, against the Mavs, ironically,
Yep.
they played each other in the first round. The Mavs pushed them to 7 as the 8th seed.
Yeah,
And now
they
that
were down 2-1 to the Mavs.
Yeah, exactly. And granted, I mean the Mavs, they were, of course, like again, like all those playoff battles, you have to think the teams knew each other very well. Dirk, he was going to bring it. It was not going to be easy for the Spurs to take him out, but I don't think anyone thought the Mavs were going to take him to 7. So that was a big surprise. And so I'm not so sure if the 2013 Spurs team would have allowed that to happen though. So but and of course, like the finals, the Spurs ended up playing the Heat again, but the Heat were clearly not nearly as good.
Yep.
So, and I'm not gonna say it was easy, but like it was definitely not as difficult in 2014 for the
Sure.
Spurs to beat the Heat as it was in 2013. So, from that standpoint, I can't disagree. Like we'll never know how, like we'll never be able to fully prove who was better, but based on the eye test, I have to agree. Like 2013 Spurs, they were just the level at which they were playing, and then of course Danny Green was
Oh, he was
phenomenal
on
in those
something.
finals.
He was on something else.
Yeah, when Danny Green was playing like that, I mean those Spurs they were unbeatable. And I
Yeah.
mean, they blew out the Heat in San Antonio those couple of games that Danny Green went off. So
Yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, so I think we're, you and I obviously watched those finals very closely. Honestly, the 2013 finals is probably the best finals I've seen. But
oh yeah, for
but
sure.
um, going back more to Tim Duncan, one one thing I talked earlier about Chris Bosh and how I really respected his selflessness and his willingness to sacrifice. And to me, I think that you talk about that and you put it on steroids, you get Tim Duncan.
Yeah,
So even though like he was this guy who was very unassuming, never carried himself
so
around too much too much of an ego, and obviously made plenty of sacrifices, whether it was his taking a pay cut, taking a not demand, not pouting, and a touch on a post up touch every possession, doing a lot of the small things, kind of like I said about Chris Bosh, sliding down to the 5 after David Robinson retired, and being this elite defensive guy, um, and being a good teammate and leader and mentor for guys like Manu, Tony Parker, eventually Kawhi. little bit of LaMarcus Aldridge. All the things I said about Chris Bosh, you have to you amplify the scope, and you get the winning mentality and selflessness of Tim Duncan.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Spurs overall, they preached that mentality, and Duncan was, of course, the leader of that group. And yeah, I don't think anyone can ever question, just Duncan's, like, his character, his leadership, his just um just who, like, how, even though he wasn't the most intense guy, I mean, you could just clearly see he was all about winning. And
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, like, and it was just, no matter what day, what time, what game, like, whoever it was, you were gonna get just this consistent, productive player that Tim Duncan was. And statistically, you would fill out the stat sheet. Just, you watch him play, he was always effective. Just knew his spots, and again, like you said, he sacrificed, and he just did whatever it took to help the team win. So, and which the Spurs did a lot of for a very long time. So yeah, that's what I'll remember most about him, and I grew to appreciate him and the Spurs. And like I said, I didn't root for them all those years, but I will say, after 2013, the way they lost, I actually felt bad for them. Like, that was
same.
the first time that I ever felt bad for the Spurs losing. So, and that had a lot to do with, one, the way they lost, but also just their attitudes. Like, they weren't even sore losers about it. They gave the Heat all the credit in the world, but you could
Yep.
see it in their faces. Like, they know they could have, they had it, and it slipped away. So you could tell it was going to haunt them, and it drove them the next season. So, in a way, even though I didn't particularly root for them in the 2014 finals, when they won, I was actually happy for them. I thought,
Absolutely.
it was well deserved, and they were the best team all that entire season. So yeah, them winning that fifth ring, I actually had no problem with that. It wasn't like, oh, I was just, salty as a Mavs fan or anything. No, I actually genuinely was happy for them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I was rooting for the Heat in that finals, but when they laid that smackdown and you're moving the ball around, and I'm just like, yo, you can't help but respect, you can't help but respect this.
Yeah,
But like you said, I think the 2013 finals, the way they actually lost, and the fact that how they played that finals actually made me just finally say, you know what, I'll never say another bad thing about the Spurs.
yeah, yeah,
You
for
know,
real. Yeah.
uh, yeah. So. I'm trying to wrap this in honor of Kobe. Actually, I want to wrap this podcast up at about 60 minutes,
Oh
end on
yeah,
60.
yeah.
We're at the 58-minute mark, so I just want to do a real quick hit with you. The 2021 Hall of Fame class. Pierce is going to obviously go in, and
Hmm.
this time next year, I will say, never. I only rooted for Pierce this season. He was in Washington, but I do have to give Pierce his props, and I do respect Pierce,
Yeah,
obviously. Chris Bosh is probably a shoo-in as well for us.
yeah.
My, then after that, I'm curious, is there anyone you would like to see? Because I personally did a little bit of research, and I think it might be time for Chris Webber to end up in the Hall of Fame. Or if they're going to bypass Chris Webber again, uh, Sean Marion, Chauncey Billups,
Ooh, well, personally, I guess I would love to see Sean Marion. Now that you mentioned him,
Matrix.
he's the Matrix, and he was part of that 2011 Mavs team, and he was with the Mavs for, I would 5 years, I want to say. So, I mean, he was definitely a very productive player, and on the Mavs, and that wasn't even him at his peak. I mean, in Phoenix, he was unbelievable with Nash and Stoudemire and those
Yeah,
D'Antoni teams. So. Yeah, I mean, he's, of course, a Hall of Famer at some point, so would love to see him. But to your point, I mean, Chris Webber is another Hall of Fame caliber, and he's a bit older and a bit before, like, his prime was a bit before Marion and Chauncey,
yeah,
or maybe he and Chauncey were around the same time. But Yeah, like I wouldn't have a problem with either of the three, of course. And so, but yeah, if I had to pick one, I would go with
Go
Sean
Sean.
Marion. Yeah, which yeah,
Yeah.
and Chauncey, he's another great candidate. What those Pistons teams in the 2000s were obviously, um, they were another unique team.
Hmm.
That unique, and they of course they had that one championship, so they were definitely a big part of the 2000s era.
Yeah. Perfect timing. You literally ended at 60. So I guess we can wrap it up there. I just want to thank you, Sid, for joining me. Once again, it was good talking some hoops with you. And to the listeners, I want to thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe on whatever medium you're listening to, whether it's Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, or Spotify. And I'll catch you soon.